Hi, I'm Lynn Samita, and this is the second part of looking at how we think, how we use our mind and the brain and how it works in supporting our mind to be healthy, to be well, to be effective in life. And I especially love people who bring together ideas, they synthesize them all into sort of one perspective and really shine some light on something that's fascinating. Well, Daniel Pink is one of those authors that I especially love. He's written many books, including Blink, which you may know of, but he wrote a fascinating book titled A Whole New Mind: Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future. Well, with that kind of title, I could hardly resist it. Now, I need to say that I am a strong, dyed-in-the-wool left-brainer. I've always loved organization and tidying things. People think I get way too much joy out of my left brain organization and my lists and so on. So I've been very proud of how left brain I am. And in fact, the world really supports and rewards people that are left brainers. But Daniel Pink says things are changing, and in part due to technology, because technology is so amazing at linear sequential tasks. The computer is going to outclass the brain in terms of those kinds of logical linear sequential things. And so because of that, he believes the future is going to require something different. So he proposes that right-brainers with their creativity are going to emerge more and more as the leaders. Now, an interesting fact that I didn't know, the right brain can capture and recognize a face faster than any computer can or ever will, they believe. So the right brain is particularly fast. But I've always thought of right-brainers as kind of flighty and maybe a little disorganized. They're thinking about one idea and then another idea. They're all over the map. And if that's how you operate, you may well have received a lot of criticism for that kind of thinking and way of being in the world. And yet the creativeness is what seems to be emerging as more and more important. In part, Daniel Pink says, because of our affluence. We now have enough for the basics, and so we've moved from purely function into design, into form. And so no longer are we willing just to have an object that does the job, we want it to be beautiful. Whether it's the toaster, the kettle, a pen, we're really more and more as a society interested in design. And so as he looked at these things, he started to realize that the future will be led by right-brainers because they're more open-ended and creative and expansive in their thinking. They take in the big picture. They're able to synthesize things often more effectively than left-brainers, because left-brainers are going down that list. And we can miss things. Even on the grocery list, we're going down the list and we get to eggs that we should have picked up way back in the beginning when we were next door at the butter and the milk. And so that linear sequential is both slower and more limited. The right brain can take in so much more information and see interconnections. And so there's some attributes that Daniel Pink says are going to be more and more important for the future. He says things like design, story, symphony, and I'll talk about that in a minute, empathy, play, surprisingly, and meaning are the aptitudes that we're going to be focusing on in the future that are really going to be important to us in a more and more significant way. Well, I've already talked about design, but he thinks we could all, in fact, become artists. Artists in the sense of starting to tweak our brain to look at design. And he has a fascinating exercise if you're interested. His book is filled with little things that you can do to strengthen the right brain, because many of you may be like me and not so right brain oriented. But he said, take any object that you use and look at the design. Or take something that tremendously frustrates you and think about, how would you change it? What would you do? What would you, do to make it better, easier to handle, easier to use, more effective? When we use our brain that way, it starts to expand and, in fact, build new neural pathways as it looks for ideas that would relate to the problem. But when we go to story is really the best way that we learn. And so more and more we're coming out of the mechanical age and all of the things that go in a linear sequential way, and we are more captivated by stories. I think people have always known that stories were a wonderful way to learn, but he predicts that's going to be the way that people in the future want to learn. And then we get symphony, which is bringing together different elements, like all the instruments in an orchestra. The more that we can synthesize, take in different ideas, work collaboratively with people, the more effective we're going to be, because we're moving out of the individual making it on their own, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and that solo entrepreneur is something that hasn't really worked as well as I think a lot of people had hoped. It's often very lonely, it's often not as creative, and that the collaboration between people, the bringing together of different styles, thinkers, ideas, that often produces the best results. And for the problems in the world that we've got, the complex issues we need to tackle, we need symphony, we need collaboration. Play, I think, for those of you that know Dr. William Glasser's work of the basic needs, will be no surprise. But play is so intimately tied to learning. It's the best way to learn is when you're playing and having fun, you're engaged in something, whether it's learning cooking or creating a piece of art. Play is magical for the brain. It feeds all kinds of wonderful chemicals in and allows the brain to really function in an optimum way. And lastly, meaning. Well, we know we're meaning-making machines, if you like. We're always cooking ideas together and making meaning. But meaningfulness, relevance is critical. And one of the things I love about Dr. William Glasser's work in education is he said schools have to be teaching things that are highly relevant, that have meaningfulness for the students. That's the way to engage them. So, as we think now about the right and the left brain, we want to now nurture both sides of ourselves. And the person that I referenced in my keynote was Jill Bolte Taylor. She's a brain scientist, a neuroanatomist, and she had a massive stroke in the left hemisphere of her brain. Well, Jill tells her story in a book called My Stroke of Insight, and it's a remarkable story, a fabulous read. But she describes the process of what happened as she had the stroke, getting help, which was equally miraculous, and then her recovery. She literally, after the stroke, could not feed herself. She could not walk, talk. She was right back to a very young infant. And she had to rebuild all of her skills. In that process, she made an astonishing discovery. The person that emerged, because she, by the way, had been very left brain, very task-oriented, not always the easiest person to get along, she said that's how she would describe herself. The person that emerged after the stroke was very different. She realized the right hemisphere of her brain took over, compensated for all the damage done in the left hemisphere, and she emerged as a person insightful, compassionate, intuitive, highly tuned into the energy around her. And she said it really profoundly influenced her understanding of how important the right brain is. And in closing, her advice is, pay attention to anything that stops you from being all of who you can be, both left brain and right brain. We need that intuitive. We need the insight. We need the compassion. We need the creative. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tour into left brain and right brain, which I know is a simplification because they dance together. In the next video, I'm going to jump into an absolutely amazing topic, brain plasticity. What are we now understanding about how the brain grows, changes, how we influence it by how we use our mind affects how our brain grows and develops. So I hope you stay tuned.